Hi everyone, welcome to another informative episode on White Davy Gardening and Worm Farm. Today we're going to be doing our Worm Farm Q&A live, and we're going to be discussing Canadian nightcrawlers and how you can tell the difference between earthworms and composting worms. Oh, hi, Han White. I must apologize for being a bit late as well because I was having my lunch. So I ran out of time. Hi, Sian. Okay, so we're going to be discussing Canadian nightcrawlers, as we say, because Canadian nightcrawlers can be a bit finicky, and so sometimes I get questions about them. I have problem raising them as well, so I decided to learn more about them and decide to share what I'm learning with you. That way, if you're interested in raising Canadian nightcrawlers, then you'll have a better understanding of what they need. Okay, so let's talk about the temperatures that Canadian nightcrawlers prefer. They prefer temperatures between 40 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're storing them in your fridge, the temperature in your fridge is usually somewhere about minus 38 to around minus 45, minus 40 really. So that is 0 to minus 4 degrees Celsius. So they can survive in your fridge, and a lot of people, when they're raising them, actually keep them in their fridge. So you have to be careful with them though. They don't like heat or too much heat. Now, are Canadian nightcrawler the same as dew worms? Yes, they are. They're also called granddaddy earthworm. I don't know why they get the name granddaddy, but they're called granddaddy earthworm. Oh, hi, Russell. Now, how big can your Canadian nightcrawlers grow? I was very surprised to learn that they can grow up to 14 inches. They grow bigger than European nightcrawlers, which make them even more ideal as a fishing worm. So, how long can a Canadian nightcrawler last underwater? They can live up to 5 minutes underwater, and we're going to be discussing that a little bit further down in the discussion regarding them being underwater. No, that's a good amount of time. 5 minutes is a good amount of time for worms to be underwater, which makes them very nice for fishing because during that time that they're there under the water, they're going to be fighting and they're going to be attracting your fish. So if you're raising them for fishing purpose, then Canadian nightcrawlers are very good. Now, what happens if Canadian nightcrawlers are exposed to temperatures above 65 degrees for an extended period of time? Above 65 to 68 degrees, they will die. They rather the cooler environment. Now, what is the difference between earthworms and compost worms? Both worms are reddish color. The earthworms are reddish brown and they grow between a quarter to 6 inch or longer. They can go up to. So these are the earthworms. They can grow quarter inch up to 6 inch, and sometimes they are longer than that. In fact, Africa that was said to be over 22 feet long. Now, I wouldn't even want to come across that worm. I'd be out of there so fast. They die. Yes, you're right, Russell. They do die at temperatures above 60 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Yes. Red wigglers, however, unlike the earthworms, they are between 2 to 3 inches long. Occasionally, you will see them longer than that, but they might go up to 4 inches. But the average length of the red wigglers is 2 to 3 inches long. And these red wigglers, they are reddish purple. So the earthworm tend to be pale, reddish brown, while the red wigglers tend to be reddish purple. So if you see them, then you can readily identify them by their color. The red wiggler tail also tend to have a bit of yellowish color on it. And some red wigglers are said to have stripes. Red wigglers, yes. Red wigglers are adaptable and are able to live in temperatures from 35 to 95 degrees. And they feed on and they live in or close to decaying organic matter. But because they live in the, oh, hi, Mom. Yes, and White, I was comparing the regular earthworm to red wigglers because a lot of time people get them mixed up. So the earthworm, I was saying, they grow between 1/4 inch to 6 inches and occasionally longer, whereas the red wigglers are 2 to 3 inches, sometimes 4. Yes, so because the red wigglers prefer to live in the top 6 inches of soil where they are close to or in the organic matter that is there. So they are not good soil to have in your, sorry, they are not good worms to have in your garden, because especially if you live in areas where the temperature can go pretty low, because they won't burrow down into the soil. Let's see. Russell says red eats everything. Yes, everything. Nothing is pardoned as long as it is organic. Now, earthworms, these are ideal for your outdoor garden. And sometimes they can even be found in your containers that you plant in. They are burrowing worms, so they will surface and collect food and take the food back down into the soil where they live, because they prefer to live in soil than in the organic matter. These worms are often found in your backyard. As I say, unlike the red wigglers are not readily found in your backyard. These earthworms, they require moist soil to live in, and so they will keep burrowing down into the soil until they have moist and warm enough weather. So if the soil is too dry or the soil is too cold, they will just keep going down. And this makes them very good cultivators, so it's good to have them in your soil. Red wigglers, however, because they don't burrow down, they are not very good at tilling your soil. Now, because earthworms are burrowers, they are not good composting worms because they may not gather the food scraps that you place in your bin. So if you're placing the food scrap on the surface of your bins, the earthworm most times they will not come up to the surface to get it. They gather the material from wherever the closest region to them. So they may even harm themselves trying to burrow down through the bottom of your bins. So because of that, it is not good to use earthworms as composting worms. Now, because the red wigglers reproduce so rapidly, and they are surface dwellers and they heat so fast, then they are great for composting worms. The earthworms do not reproduce or eat as fast as these red wigglers or other composting worms. Now, how long does it take CNCs or Canadian nightcrawlers to mature? It can take them 4 to 6 weeks for them to reach maturity, and it can take 10 to 55 weeks for them to actually mature to their full adult size. So that's just a little bit. So within 10 weeks to about a year, little bit over a year, it can take them to mature to their full size. Now, worms are able to regulate their metabolism. And if you're regulating your metabolism, then they can also regulate their body size. So you notice it says that it can take them 10 weeks to reach their full adult size, or it can take them 55 weeks. So I guess it depends on pretty much all the requirements that they have in terms of moisture, food supply, and the proper temperatures. Now, what is the best way to raise Canadian nightcrawlers? Some people raise them in fridge, or you can raise them somewhere as long as the temperature is below 65, then it is good for them. You don't want your temperature to go over 65, as I mentioned before. When you keep them in the fridge, however, at that temperature where they are at 0 to 4 or up to 40, 0 to 4, 0 to minus 4 degrees Celsius, which is about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, then they tend to go into what seem to be an hibernative state, because in the fridge it's a little bit too cold, so they tend to slow down and not reproduce. So if you're raising them for them to reproduce, then the fridge would not be a good option, and the worms cannot stay in the fridge for very long. If you're going to raise your worms in the fridge, then you need to change their bedding material every 3 weeks. Now, how often should your CNC bins be aerated? Your Canadian nightcrawler bin need to be aerated every 2 to 4 weeks. And what about changing their bedding? How often should you change their bedding? It is good to remove some of their bedding. It's recommended about 10% of their bedding, to remove 10% of their bedding every 4 to 6 months and replace it with fresh bedding. Now, here are some tips and warning about raising Canadian nightcrawlers. If you use a cover on the bin, then it must have holes in it. Remember that these worms do not like heat. And the lid, you will need to remove it very often so that the bin can have a good supply of airflow, and that will help to keep the bin cool as well. So every couple of days, remove the cover and let it stay off for a period of time, and then recover the bin, and you keep doing that to help keep the bin cool. When watering your bin, Make sure that the water temperature is similar to the temperature that is in the bin. Worms, not just Canadian nightcrawlers, but worms as a whole, they drastic changes in temperature, not suddenly. So when you're watering your worms, you want to make sure that your water temperature is pretty close to the temperature that is in their bin. So you can pretty much feel the temperature of the bin and feel the temperature of the water, or you can use a thermometer to test the temperature, but don't drastically change the temperature of your bin suddenly because it can be harmful to your worms. And if it doesn't harm them, it will cause them to slow down and it will take a while for them to recover. And the whole purpose of having them is for them to be productive. So you don't want to do anything that is going to reduce your production or your productivity. Okay, now if your CNCs are kept in the fridge, do not have them out of the fridge for more than 5 minutes. Materials used for bedding must not contain any form of chemical fertilizer or pesticide. If you're using ice pack that is non-toxic to cool down your Canadian nightcrawler bins and the ice pack burst in your bin, remove the content of that bin and restart your bin. Because although it is non-toxic, it is still material that you do not want to have in your worm bin. Do not allow rotten or moldy food to remain in your Canadian nightcrawler worm bin, because if you do, then it can cause problems for your worms. Although the worms like to feed on the microbes and the bacteria that is produced from food that is breaking down, if you have too much of that in your bin, then it can be harmful. And especially so if you're keeping these worms in your refrigerator. Do Canadian nightcrawlers require more care than other composting worms? Definitely. Regular composting worms, you provide them with bedding, moisture, and food, and they are good to go. You don't have to be checking on them regularly unless you feed them on a daily basis. But with the Canadian nightcrawlers, their bedding need to be changed regularly. Temperatures in their bin has to be monitored frequently, and they have to have sufficient moisture at all times. So you know how you might have your European or your red wiggler bin drying out a bit and your worms are still okay. With the Canadian nightcrawlers, they are so finicky, they die very easily. If you have dead or sick worms in your Canadian nightcrawler bin, it is best to remove it as quickly as possible to prevent them from infecting the others. Usually, when a worm dies in a worm bin, they break down very easily and the other worms will feed on the carcass. But when you have dead worms in your Canadian nightcrawler bin, it can be a bit more problematic for the worms. So once you come across them, it's best to remove them, especially if you have more than one dead ones. Now, how long does Canadian nightcrawlers live? Does anyone know how long the Canadian nightcrawlers can live? Who wants to take a guess? Have you heard of Herman the Worm? No? What's the story behind Herman the Worm? I'd like to hear that one. Over 25 years. Oh, well, I have never really kept any worms for that long, for long enough to know based on my experience, but based on the research that I've done, it is said that the Canadian nightcrawlers can live for up to 10 years as long as they have the proper temperature, enough moisture, and sufficient food. So they can live up to 10 years. The biggest problems to worms are actually predators. So if they have the right conditions, as long as they're not exposed to predators, then they can live up to 10 years. Okay, why do night crawlers feed at night? Night crawlers feed at night because they need moisture in order to be able to breathe. And when they surface within the day, the heat of the sun may dry them out, and without the moisture on their skin, then they cannot breathe. So, for that reason, they come up at night to feed in order to minimize the risk. In a worm bin, however, because the bin is always cool or moist, then the worms can feed all day and all night if they so desire. Okay, I'm still waiting on that story about Herman the Worm. Okay, do night crawlers come out of the ground when it rains because they may drown? What do you think? Let's see. Google International Worm Czar. They may shed light on Irma the worm. Okay, I'm going to do that. Let me just jot that down so I don't forget. Okay, yes, so when it rains, you always see lots of worms moving around, and some say it's because their area is flooded or because they may drown. Herman was a famous Canadian nightcrawler. Oh, interesting. I would like to get to know more about this Herman. Why is he so famous? Must be a good story behind it, that to the extent that they actually named the worm. Interesting. I'm gonna check that out right after the live. Yes, so believe it or not, worms can survive in water for very long time. So earlier I mentioned that the Canadian nightcrawler can live for 5 minutes in water, but worms can live in water for a very long time. They can live in water indefinitely as long as there is sufficient oxygen in the water for them to be able to breathe. And that is evident by my experience where I had my hydroponic system and I put a pound of worms in it. And those worms, I had no problem with them. My worms, those were the fattest worms I've ever had, actually. So I know based on experience and research that worms can live in water as long as they have sufficient oxygen. Now there are various type of hydroponic system. Mine used a pump, so the water is continually being aerated. So once you're aerating the water, the worms can survive. Let's see what Russell says here. I have met Herman on a few occasions. His caretaker was an influence of mine. Okay, nice. Okay, let's see. Where was I? What question was I on? Oh, yes, we were talking about the worms living in water. So the reason that they don't usually come out of the ground is because, as I mentioned before, they take the risk of drying out in the sun. After it has rained or weather, the environment is now humid, and so the worms feel comfortable and they will come up and roam about. So they're not coming up because they are in danger from drowning, but because the place is more humid and so they're more accustomed to that kind of environment, so they will come out. Unfortunately, though, a lot of worms, when they come up because of the rain, will come up close to asphalt or concrete. And once they go on the concrete, they become disoriented and they can't find their way back to the soil quite easily. And so a lot of them will end up dying. And so a lot of times when I see them, I would try to take as many as I can and try to put them back on the soil and they can make their way to a safe location. Okay, so do worms hibernate? What do you think? I'm not going to answer that question just yet. I want to see what your opinion is on it. Okay, I'll answer the question then. Do worms hibernate? Worms actually don't hibernate. So when the time gets cold, for those worms that can, let's see, some years I think the reds do, and the crawlers go down deep. Okay. Yeah, they don't hibernate. When the time gets cold, they do slow down because, as I mentioned before, they can control their metabolism. They, instead of hibernating, they go into a state that is called estivation. In that state, they curl themselves up tightly and slow down their metabolism, but they do not hibernate. I'm going to be doing some more research on that estivation state because I would like to know exactly what goes on. Do they stay in that position? How long do they stay in that position? Do they feed occasionally? Or when they slow down their metabolism, how long can they last without feeding? So I'm going to have to do some more research on that because it would be interesting to see what actually goes on. Okay, so these are all the questions that I had prepared for today. So if you have any questions or if there's any comments that you want to make, or feel free to chit chat, then that's okay. So, Mom, you mentioned that you don't really like worms. Have you ever gone and looked at Ann White's worms? I know you mentioned before that before and White started the worm bin, you used to put the food scraps in your garden and you would see a lot of the worms coming and gathering around that area. What do you do when you see them? Do you move them or you just let them stay? Oh, okay. She never go and look at them. Okay. Makes sense still, because those worms are huge based on some photos that you have sent me. So if you don't like worms, then I don't think I would go and look on a container with a lot of them either. But you know, on White, your worms, the images of the worms that you sent me, they are pretty large, but no one that I've ever seen raising European nightcrawlers. I've never seen any of their European nightcrawlers being as big as yours. I'm wondering why that is. Could it be because of location? Because naturally they're from Europe, so they will reach their full potential in a European country. But could that be the reason why in other locations they tend to be smaller than yours? What size does your European nightcrawlers grow up to? From the images that you sent me, they look as if they're about 10 inches or so. I don't know. They are big, very big, and most of them are pregnant. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd like to find out though. I'd really like to find out if it is the location why yours are so big while others are so small. I wish there were more than one persons that I could talk to from different location and figure out if they're using a similar method to you. Oh, hi Nikki. Yeah, I'm glad that you were able to stop by to say hi. Yes, I would like to be able to talk to several people who raise these Canadian night crawlers to see if they feed them the same rate that you feed yours on White. Would they have worms as big as yours with these Canadian night crawlers? In fact, I think maybe I'm going to have a set of European night crawlers set aside and feed them the way you feed yours and see if they will grow up to the same size as yours. I've never seen that before, so it would be interesting to see. For those of you who raise Canadian nightcrawler, what is the biggest size that you've ever seen your nightcrawler grow to? I'm not able to tell yet. I only got started with them a few months ago and they haven't grown to their full size yet, so I have no idea. I'm unsure about the length, but they are pretty long. Okay. I'm gonna bug you later to go and measure one. Yeah, it is said that the Canadian nightcrawlers grow bigger than the European nightcrawlers. So it would be interesting to know just how big these European nightcrawlers get. And I can compare them for myself with the Canadian nightcrawlers. And when they say worms grow up to a certain length, like for example, they say the Canadian nightcrawlers can grow up to 14 inches. Is that 14 inches when they're stretched to their full potential, or is it 14 inches when they're in their relaxed state? Do you know? Does any of you know? I would like to know. It's dark outside. Okay, let's see. 12, 30, round about there. So that would be about 6:30. Okay. Yeah, it would be dark at this time. Yeah. Well, there's always tomorrow or some other time. There's no rush. But I'd really like to know how long they are. Okay, so I have seen and I've had in my hands Canadian Nightcrawlers 16 inches long relaxed. Really? That's a beast. That might be Herman's cousin or something. I think it is when they are stretched. Okay. 16 inches relaxed. Wow. Let's see. 16 inches, that's about the distance of two framing lumber. Hmm. That's a pretty long worm. I don't know if I would want to see 16 inches worm, a lot of them in one location. No. And that's crazy. Somebody who raises worm and yet still. I don't mind the red wigglers, but other worms that are that long, they can be creepy. Even sometimes when I'm going fishing, I handle the fishing worm, I put them on my hook by myself and everything. But I don't know, holding them in my hand and feel them wiggling is just. I am Ellen. Let's see. Ellen says, "Hi everyone. I don't have any worms yet and have a tiny place. Just researching." Also as big as US dime. Are you saying, Russell, that they're as fat as a US dime? That would be crazy. Let's see. Mom says, "I normally put them in the communal garden." Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. That's a big worm. Let's see what I miss. I've got a tiny garden too, Helen. Okay. Now let's see. So Ellen, are you planning to start raising worms? There are a lot of information out there that you can find on raising worms, and there are so many YouTube channels that you can find practical information on. And as you can see, I do Q&A live on Fridays at midday GMT 6 my time. So you can feel free to come on and ask any question you have about worms. I'm no expert, but I do know a little bit. So if you have questions, Helen, you can feel free to either shoot me an email or leave a comment below my videos or stuff like that, and I will get back to you with whatever answer you may need. Okay, I've got two worm bins. But and white, your two worm bins could end up being about 10 worm bin based on the size of the bins that you've got there. Yeah, I don't know. I got quite a few bins, but my bins are small. Try to keep them small because I really don't like having to lift them. And I do have to lift them every time I go out to water them, because the way I set up the worm farm, I have to set it up in a way that I maximize the space that I have. So I have them on shelving. So every time I tend to the bin, I have to lift them up. So I have to keep the bins small. And White says, yes, they're big bins. Yeah, I know you. I've seen your videos. Thankfully, you don't have to really move them around a lot. Tony, need changing? You can do it. Okay. All right. And you're certain? Check otherwise. Nope. Sorry about that. All right. Let's see. Melanie Ellis says, I love gardening, but it's scared to death of worms. Lot of worms in my garden. I'm always running and screaming when I run into them. Ah. Yeah. Don't worry, you're not alone. A lot of people are afraid of worm. The good thing is that you have them in your garden. You don't have to put them in a worm bin because, as you say, you have plenty of them in your garden. So you're still getting the benefit of having worms without you having to raise them. And you're supposed to know I like to laugh. So if I see you running, I'd be laughing like crazy. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Worms are nice. They're nice to have in your garden because of the many benefits that you get from them. But handling them, especially the larger type of worms, it's not really nice unless you're wearing gloves. Child, your hands are distracting in my camera.
Sorry.
Let's see. I like to fill a 5 gallon bucket half full of bedding, stacked 5 high. Oh, 5 gallon buckets, half full of bedding, and stacked 5 high. Um, the lady that I bought my worms from, she only raised worms in 5 gallon buckets. And when she was doing this big time, she's the largest or was the largest supplier in our region until recently. She decided to cut back. She used 5 gallon buckets and she would raise each of the buckets above the other. So she would use something like an inch and a half thick board to keep one bucket above the other so that the worms do not migrate up from one bucket to another. And she would just stockpile them 1, 2, 3 high. She had a lot of worms and that's all she used, 5 gallon buckets. And then she would set up her system so that she's got 3 buckets with worms and the fourth bucket would be at the bottom with a drain pipe in it so that she can harvest the leachate from it. And I said leachate and not worm tea because a lot of people confused worm tea with leachate. Leachate and worm tea, they are not the same. Leachate is just the water that runs off from your worm bin. It does not have as much nutrients is it in it as when you use the worm castings to make the worm tea. One of my worm bin is 175 liters. Holy moly. Let's see. The blue bin that I have my Canadian Nightcrawlers in, that is a 76 liters. So that means you have two and a half, roughly two and a half the size of that. Whoa, that's a big bin. It's a very big bin. It's nice that you don't have to move it. Does it have wheels in case you have to move it? Yes, I am glad I have them in the garden. Yeah, they're certainly nice. The worms are certainly nice to have in the garden. Okay, it has wheels. Nice. Okay, I'm gonna be signing off soon. It seems as if my little guy needs me. When you have young kids, you're not really free. So I'm gonna be signing off pretty soon. So if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask. Let's see. Where in Jamaica are you from? I am originally from Kingston. Are you familiar with Jamaica? Me too. Okay. Let's see. All right. I think I'm going to be. And the sun. I don't know. Yes, I think I'm going to be signing off. No. See ya. See ya. They just have to get themselves in the show one way or another. All right, so that is it. Let's see. Am I missing anything down here? See, I have been to Jamaica many times. 72 years old now, but even climbed Dunn's River Fall. Nice. Very nice. Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. Same to you, Ann White. Yes, I'm going to be signing off now. I need to go and look after my son. So it was nice to have you guys on my program. Nice talking to you. And I hope to see you again. Please like the video. Oh, okay. Thanks, Ann White. Yeah, so I'm gonna be signing off now. I hope to see you on my live again on Monday. I'll be doing a gardening Q&A live. So, and that is at 5 p.m. GMT 6 time. Take care. Bye, Helen. Bye, Melanie. Bye, Russell. Bye, Mom. And for everyone else who is on the live, I hope you all enjoy your weekend and stay safe. See you again next week. See ya. Child. No. Don't do that again, please. See ya.